The day began like so many others in this quiet, small Midwestern town. Kids off to school, parents off to work. Another quiet day at the water utility. The water treatment operator on duty couldn't believe it at first when the alarm sounded.
And he opened the door to go out in the hallway to go to the chlorine room to see if there really was a problem. And as soon as he opened the office door, the chlorine gas hit him. And he knew then and there that it was bad.
Fighting for air, he quickly alerts the supervisor and evacuates the building, fighting the effects of the chlorine burning his eyes and throat.
When you get a really good whiff of it, your first reaction is to just run and run away as far and as fast as you can.
Set on a collision course, the green chlorine cloud drifts toward town as emergency crews advance to establish a safety perimeter and evacuate nearby residents.
And I was alone here with my dog. My husband was out of town. There was a knock on the door. It was about 8 o'clock. And a policeman in a full gas mask and attire told me I had 5 minutes to evacuate without an explanation of what had happened, just that it was an emergency.
Armed with SCBA units and protective suits, emergency crews move in.
So it was really hard to pinpoint where the leak was on the cylinder, or if it was the cylinder at all.
The emergency crews locate the source of the leak. Fighting against time, heat, and fatigue, the crew halts the flow of the deadly gas. In a few hours, the gas dissipates, leaving behind scorched trees and ruined equipment.
The hardest part of this whole experience and the longest lasting effect was the devastation that occurred to all our equipment in this plant.
This small Midwestern town learned the toughest lesson for anyone who uses chlorine. Accidents can and do happen. And when they do, you have to rely on your training.
What we learned was you can't train enough. You can't train enough with the SCBAs. You can't train enough with your chlorine suits. You can't train enough with your chlorine repair kits.
Luckily, there were no fatalities and only minor injuries from inhaling the gas. Everyone knew it could have been worse.
And I view ourselves as being very lucky.
When it comes to chlorine, safety comes first. This video will provide you with basic facts about chlorine gas, discuss the importance of employee training, detail the safety equipment you should be using, describe how to transport, store, and inspect chlorine containers, offer guidelines for working safely with chlorine, and outline proper safety procedures in case an emergency occurs. The AWWA Participants Guide on Chlorine Safety provides even more detail. Be sure to review it regularly and keep it handy on the job. We all have a common goal when it comes to handling chlorine: the safety of yourself, your coworkers, and your community.
I've taken a couple of breaths of really strong chlorine gas, and it truly is one of the most frightening experiences I have ever had.
What you know about chlorine can save your life, or the lives of your coworkers. Here's the basics of what you need to know about chlorine. Highly effective as a disinfectant, chlorine has been in use since the early 1900s. However, chlorine is also an extremely hazardous chemical. When exposed to air, liquid chlorine quickly vaporizes, forming a greenish-yellow gas with a strong and pungent odor. Nearly 2.5 times heavier than air, chlorine gas settles in low areas and along the floor. Chlorine gas is a respiratory irritant and will burn in the mouth, nose, and lungs. Combined with moisture, liquid chlorine creates a powerful acid that will burn skin and eyes on contact. For these reasons, the recommended National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, or NIOSH, short-term limit is 0.5 parts per million. This means you should not be exposed to chlorine at concentrations exceeding 1/2 part per million for even a short period of time. 15 minutes is the limit. The IDLH for chlorine is 10 parts per million. This means that at 10 parts per million, chlorine is considered immediately dangerous to life or health. Chlorine is not flammable or explosive on its own, but it is a strong oxidizer and will support combustion. Chlorine reacts explosively with many commonly used chemicals, including acetylene, ammonia, ether, turpentine, even fuel gas. Always keep combustible materials stored separately to prevent violent reactions. Since water utilities use chlorine daily, we sometimes forget the importance of a chlorine safety training program. But that safety training could mean the difference between life and death. Now that you know the basics, it's time to look at the important elements of a training program.
It just, to me, it just kind of reinforces the fact that everybody has to be trained and trained thoroughly to know how to use an SCBA and know how to put it on really, really fast. Because the panic is just overwhelming when you get a breath of that stuff. There's nothing like it, nothing else like it that I've ever experienced.
In an emergency, you must react quickly and decisively. Your life and the lives of others may be at risk, so a comprehensive training program is essential to your safety. Your training program should review the chemical properties of chlorine, outline safe methods for transporting and storing chlorine containers, teach the proper use of safety equipment, and drill employees in the emergency response to leaks, including first aid. The first stop for basic information on chlorine is the Material Safety Data Sheet, or MSDS. It contains valuable information on chlorine's properties and safety tolerances. If you don't have one, contact your supplier and make it available to all employees. Before working around chlorine in any capacity, you should be thoroughly familiar with the characteristics of chlorine gas and the equipment being used. Emergency procedures training should include respiratory protection and first aid. All employees who use a self-contained breathing apparatus must be properly trained, fit tested, and medically certified. Training should also include ventilation procedures and leak repair. Effective training means ongoing training. Updates, refreshers, and follow-up training should be provided on a regular basis. It also means having the right safety equipment.
SCBAs are self-contained breathing apparatuses, and it's what the firefighters use to go into burning buildings so they can breathe. Typically, they give you about a 30-minute supply of oxygen, we used to have one at our plant. We now have 4. So that's another thing that changed since the chlorine leak. We're buying more safety equipment and looking at more all the time.
Your safety equipment is your lifeline in a chlorine emergency. It can help prevent chlorine inhalation and burns to your eyes and skin. Always make sure you have the correct safety equipment and that you know where it is stored. Common items include a full face shield, goggles, rubber gloves, a hard hat, and corrosion-resistant coveralls. Always store equipment in a clean locker, protected from chemicals or dust. Be sure to inspect your protective clothing before each use. If you don't find the tear, the chlorine will. The single most important piece of safety equipment is the self-contained breathing apparatus, or SCBA. Respiratory protection equipment must always be available where chlorine gas is handled and must be stored in a separate area. All SCBAs must meet National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health requirements. You should be fully trained in its use, and it must always be kept in proper working order. An SCBA should have at least a 30-minute supply of Class D breathing air. Regular fit tests are required for all employees. Beards and even mustaches can interfere with a good fit, so if you work with chlorine, break out the razors. It could mean the difference between life and death. OSHA, as well as many states, require testing of the respirators every 3 years. Inspect all SCBAs monthly and document the inspection. Your utility should also have a written respiratory protection program. This program should be used to train all employees who work with chlorine. Whenever working with chlorine, don't take chances. Always wear protective clothing and know how to use your safety equipment.
The best he could tell, it appeared as though it were coming from like a seam in the cylinder where the end of the cylinder met the wall of the cylinder. But as it turns out, that wasn't the case at all. The cylinder was fine, and the gas was actually coming from some of our own apparatus.
Chlorine leaks are more likely to happen when the containers are being moved. Be sure you know how to properly transport, inspect, and store chlorine containers. Chlorine is shipped in containers ranging from 90-ton railroad tank cars to 150-pound cylinders. In the water utility industry, chlorine is normally sold in 1-ton containers or smaller 150-pound cylinders. Each chlorine container must be properly marked and labeled in accordance with the Department of Transportation, or DOT. The DOT also regulates container construction. Each container has a specification number, serial number, identifying symbol, and hydrostatic test date. The DOT placard number for chlorine is 1017. You should display the proper placard for chlorine on any vehicle carrying chlorine containers. Most water utilities have chlorine delivered by a supplier, but you may have to move cylinders to remote pump stations or to a different area within your facility. When transporting by vehicle, you must comply with the regulations from your State Department of Transportation. If chlorine is shipped interstate, federal DOT regulations may prevail. Check with your State Department of Transportation to ensure you're following all laws. Transport 1-ton containers in a horizontal position. Keep them blocked while on the vehicle to prevent rolling. Valve covers should remain in place during transport. And the valve side of the cylinders must face the passenger side of the vehicle. Sometimes, containers are defective or become damaged in transit. Be sure to inspect each container thoroughly before accepting a chlorine shipment. Check all containers for anything that may contribute to a leak. Watch for dents, gouges, corrosion, pitting or bulges. Feel each container. If a container is hot to the touch, internal moisture or contamination may be present. If there are any doubts about a container, do not accept it. Refuse the container and have the shipper send it back to the supplier. When transferring containers from the truck to the storage area, you must use a proper hoisting device. This device must have sufficient lifting capacity, and its rating must be posted. Inspect the lifting device frequently to ensure that the cables, clamps, and lifting bars are in good condition. Always document your inspections. Use extreme care when handling containers. Move 150-pound cylinders by clamping or chaining them to a hand truck. Store 150-pound cylinders securely so they won't tip over. Keep the valve covers on to prevent damage to the valve. Chlorine containers can be stored either inside or outside, but make sure that the container is not stored below ground level, such as in a basement. Containers stored outside should be shaded from direct sunlight. Keep the outside storage area well maintained to prevent a fire hazard. Design your storage area to facilitate replacement of empty containers. Ideally, 1-ton containers should not be hoisted over another, especially one that is online.
We don't look at each other anymore and say, I don't know, scrubber costs $100,000. That's a lot of money. We don't have that attitude here. Spend the money on things like emergency chlorine valves that will shut off the gas supply if your detector senses a leak. Scrubbers. It's just another chunk of insurance you can have to prevent an occurrence like this.
When working with chlorine, it's important to have the right equipment, the right training, and the proper facility. A well-designed chlorine room should have these common characteristics. Whenever possible, chlorine containers should be stored separately from the chlorinators. All chlorine rooms should have at least 2 doors for emergency exit. These doors should have panic hardware and should open to the exterior of the building. Make sure you have adequate clearance around all of the chlorine components. A switch controlling the fan and light should be located outside the chlorine room, near an inspection window. Each room should have a ventilating system with the capacity to provide at least 1 complete air change every 5 minutes. Install a chlorine detection system to warn of leaks in both the chlorine storage and chlorinator rooms. Some local fire codes may require you to install a scrubber system. Check with your local fire department to be sure. The chlorine system should be designed and built according to recommended standards for piping, valves, fittings, and regulators. The Chlorine Institute, your own state or provincial government, or AWWA can provide help with design standards. There are two important regulatory programs that address the storage and use of chlorine: the Clean Air Act's Section 112R Risk Management Program and OSHA's Process Safety Management Regulations. Each program is triggered if a utility uses or stores chlorine in quantities that exceed a specified threshold quantity. Be sure to check the specific details of these regulations and make sure your utility complies with both programs. A minimum of at least 2 people, each equipped with proper respiratory and eye protection, are recommended when working with chlorine systems. One person should be the backup and remain outside the chlorine room during all changes and maintenance operations. In many cases, a 3-member team is recommended for proper safety. During normal operation of a chlorination facility, the system should be periodically inspected to check routine operations, perform preventive maintenance tasks, and verify the safety and security of the facility. Preventive maintenance operations should be conducted according to manufacturer's guidelines. Remember, chlorine leaks are most likely to occur when the chlorination system is being worked on during routine maintenance or when containers are being changed.
And you could hear the gas escaping. It was just a real loud rush of air, and just within a matter of seconds, the gas was so strong, and that's when I got my first real breath of chlorine gas ever, and it's the panic is incredible. It's just like you're underwater and you can't breathe.
The worst has happened, and there is a chlorine leak. There is no time to plan. You must react. It is time to rely on your emergency procedures, including your evacuation plan and first aid training. The characteristic odor of chlorine will provide the first warning. If a sharp odor is present, immediately evacuate the area and notify your fire department or other local emergency agency, as well as your chlorine supplier. Chlorine will settle in low areas, so stay upwind and above the leak. Never try to fix a leak by yourself. Leak repair should be attempted only if you are well trained and have at least one other person to assist. When entering a potentially IDLH atmosphere, you must be equipped with the appropriate breathing apparatus and a fully encapsulated suit approved for chlorine. At least one similarly equipped person must be available outside the IDLH area for rescue purposes. In addition, a hazmat decontamination team must be available and ready to assist workers when they exit the hot zone. To find the leak, spray an ammonia solution at the suspected point. A chlorine leak will produce a white fume or cloud. Try to isolate the container at the valve. If the container itself is leaking, use the emergency repair kit. Rotate the container if necessary to keep the liquid from escaping. Do not touch any spilled liquid. It will burn your skin. If you are exposed to chlorine, get help fast. All contaminated clothing should be removed under a shower. Chlorine on skin areas must be thoroughly washed with large amounts of water. If your eyes are exposed to chlorine gas, immediately flush with water. Continue flushing for at least 15 minutes. Hold the eyelids open to make sure the membranes under the eyelids are also flushed. Do not put eye drops or other chemicals in the eyes without a physician's approval. Keep the victim warm and quiet and watch for complications. Adverse effects from contact or inhalation may be delayed, so symptoms may not be obvious immediately. Seek proper medical attention as soon as possible. If the victim is unconscious or immobile, call for emergency medical care immediately. When performing a rescue, make sure you are adequately protected before entering the contaminated area to remove the victim. If the victim has stopped breathing, immediately start CPR and administer oxygen as soon as possible.
Whatever you're doing, don't be comfortable that you've done what you need to do. It's not enough, and I don't think it ever will be. So what we've learned is no matter what it costs, be prepared for it, train constantly with the safety equipment, with the fire department, do your drills.
Chlorine can be dangerous. It's that simple. Protect yourself, protect your coworkers, and protect your community with these important steps. 1. Only employees with proper training should work with chlorine gas. 2. Self-contained breathing apparatus should always be available in the work area. 3. Use proper lifting equipment when moving containers and secure them tightly. Never drop or allow containers to collide. 4. Always work with a standby person when repairing or changing chlorine containers. 5. Never apply water or moisture to a leaking container. A very dangerous reaction can occur. 6. At all times, avoid inhalation of chlorine gas in contact with your skin and eyes. 7. Think safety.
It can happen, and don't ever think it can't, because we knew it always could. We just didn't think it would. And now we know it can, and it will.
Chlorine can be a killer. Always treat it as a hazard to your life and health. Be alert to the hazards on the job. Anticipate potential hazards and be prepared to take corrective action. Do your part to maintain a safe working environment for yourself, your coworkers, and your community. When it comes to chlorine, safety comes first. For more information on this or any other AWWA product, call 1-800-926-7337 or visit www.awwa.org.